In the earliest centuries of India's spiritual history, long before the rise of carved stone temples or towering gopurams, worship was practiced in nature's open arms. The Vedic period, dating back over 3,000 years, was a world of hymns chanted beneath the sky, fire rituals conducted in forest clearings, and offerings made to elemental deities like Agni, Indra, and Varuna. These early rituals were not centered around icons or constructed temples, but focused instead on ephemeral flame, the sacred word, and the alignment of the cosmos. Yet even in these early rites, the seeds of the temple were quietly growing. As time flowed and civilizations matured, spiritual needs found form and structure. Slowly, the symbolic power of the yajna fire was embodied in shrines, small, modest, and built of wood or mud brick at first. These sacred enclosures began to house stones or abstract symbols representing the divine. By the time of the Maurya and Gupta periods, the worship of deities like Shiva, Vishnu, and Devi had become more focused and personal. The divine form began to be sculpted, given a face and expression. Thus, the path toward the Hindu temple began, rooted in reverence, shifting with devotion. In these humble beginnings, we see a transition from the abstract to the embodied, from ritual space to sacred architecture. Early temples were not just places of prayer, but were becoming symbolic universes. The Vedic fire altar had once represented the cosmos, and now, temples began to adopt that cosmic purpose in stone. Every pillar, every carved doorway, every alignment to cardinal directions was an echo of sacred geometry. The divine was no longer only evoked, it was now housed. Though much of what we know comes from surviving later structures, archaeological remnants in places like Ujjain and Sanchi show the foundational moments of temple development. Stone bases, simple sanctums, and traces of early icon worship whisper of a devotional culture finding its form. These early temples were rarely grand, but they were alive with reverence. Each stone laid was an offering, every structure a metaphor. Worship was slowly becoming a physical journey, guiding the devotee inward. By the end of this formative era, the idea of the Hindu temple as a living embodiment of the divine had taken root. It would soon flourish into soaring towers, sanctified courtyards, and halls filled with music and incense. But at its heart would remain the same flame from those ancient forests, a light of devotion, flickering between this world and the eternal. In the vast forests and river valleys of ancient India, the transition from temporary sacrificial altars to lasting temple structures was slow, but deeply symbolic. At first, worship remained centered around natural forces: trees, rivers, stones. These elements were not mere metaphors. They were believed to hold divinity. A sacred grove could serve as a temple, and a smooth stone uncarved could represent a deity. The construction of the first shrine sought to honor these forces, while creating a sacred enclosure that protected the divine presence, making it accessible to human devotion without diminishing its mystery. With the growth of settlements and the rise of dynasties like the Mauryas and Guptas, artisans and priests began shaping worship into defined forms. Stone gradually replaced wood, and sanctums were carved with more precision. Temples such as those found at Udayagiri or early structures in Madhya Pradesh showcased a growing understanding of sacred architecture. The idea that the temple was a microcosm of the universe gained popularity. The Garbhagriha, the innermost sanctum, was seen as the spiritual womb, housing the deity and symbolizing the cosmic source. Each structural decision was intentional. The axis of the temple was aligned with celestial bodies. The steps leading upward mimicked the soul's ascent, and the tower, Shikara, over the sanctum symbolized the cosmic mountain, Meru. Temples were not just places of worship. They were designed to elevate the spirit. Even as they became more permanent and elaborate, they retained the essence of the open-air yajna, a bridge between the earthly and eternal, the visible and the unseen. The shift to structured temples also allowed for the introduction of sculpture and storytelling. With stone came permanence, and with permanence came narrative. Carvings of gods, mythic battles, celestial beings, and meditating sages adorned the walls. These visual scriptures turned the temple into a silent teacher. Even the illiterate could walk along a corridor and understand the epics of Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Puranic lore. In every chisel stroke was devotion, and in every pillar a lesson. Thus, the evolution from forest altar to stone shrine was not merely about materials. It marked the maturing of India's spiritual architecture. The divine, once worshipped in the elements, now resided in spaces built with intention, mathematics, and symbolism. But always, the breath of the forest and the fire of the yugna lingered in these new sanctuaries, grounding them in tradition even as they reached for the heavens. As India's spiritual vision deepened, so did the temple's architectural complexity. By the 6th and 7th centuries, two major architectural styles began to emerge: the Nagara style in the north and the Dravidian style in the south. Each developed distinct characteristics based on geography, regional patronage, and evolving theological ideas. The Nagara style favored curvilinear towers, known as shikaras, rising sharply above the sanctum like a flame ascending to the heavens. In contrast, the Dravidian style displayed tiered pyramid-shaped towers called vimanas, rich with elaborate carvings and surrounding gateways, or gopurams, that became monumental in scale. In the north, temples like those at Khajuraho became renowned not just for their architectural brilliance, but for their expressive art. Erotic sculptures, mythological narratives, and celestial beings adorned the outer walls. These were not merely decorative. They reflected the belief that life's physical and spiritual aspects were interconnected. The temple exterior embodied samsara, the world of desires and illusions, while the inner sanctum symbolized moksha, or liberation. As one walked toward the deity, the journey was as much inward as outward, a slow shedding of the sensual toward the serene. In the south, dynasties like the Pallavas and later the Cholas oversaw a temple-building renaissance. The shore temple at Mahabalipuram, carved near the sea, and the massive Brihadishwara temple in Tanjore stood as marvels of engineering and devotion. These temples were not just places of worship. They served as administrative centers, hubs of art and music, and economic engines. Festivals drew pilgrims from across the subcontinent, and the temples stored grain, supported schools, and employed thousands. They were sacred cities within cities, microcosms of the cosmos humming with life. While regional differences defined stylistic elements, the heart of the temple experience remained the same: darshan, the act of seeing and being seen by the divine. Pilgrims would bathe in temple tanks or rivers, cleanse body and mind, and approach the sanctum with folded hands. In the hushed, incense-laced air of the Garbhagriha, a single flame flickering beside the deity could move hearts more deeply than 1,000 sermons. The temple thus became a space where architecture, art, and ritual merged into a deeply personal spiritual journey. Through centuries, despite invasions, natural decay, and changing empires, the temple stood resilient. They adapted. Some were rebuilt, others expanded, but the sacred geometry, the symbolism of form, and the rhythms of ritual remained. Just as a river changes course yet retains its flow, the Indian temple tradition continued to evolve, shaping the spiritual consciousness of a land that still finds in stone and silence the path to the eternal. As the Indian subcontinent spiritual canvas expanded, regional kingdoms embraced temple construction not only as religious devotion, but also as an assertion of political power and cultural prestige. The Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, and Hoslas in the Deccan Plateau became master patrons of sacred architecture. Their temples, carved from stone with astonishing intricacy, were filled with myths and cosmic symbolism. The Kailasa temple at Ellora, for example, was carved downward from a single rock, symbolizing Mount Kailash, the mythical home of Lord Shiva, demonstrating both divine inspiration and human ingenuity. One of the most breathtaking contributions came from the Hosla dynasty, whose temples at Belur and Halebidu were often described as poetry in stone. These structures featured thousands of sculpted panels depicting gods, celestial nymphs, battle scenes, musicians, dancers, and stories from epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana. Every inch of the stone was alive with storytelling. Walking along these corridors was like turning the pages of a sacred illustrated book, where art and faith blended into one seamless experience of divine imagination. Temples also evolved functionally, becoming integral to daily life. Beyond prayer, they serve as centers of education, law, and charity. Sanskrit schools, gurukuls, flourished within temple complexes, where students learned not just religious scriptures, but mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Women, too, played roles as temple dancers, devadesis, musicians, and even administrators in certain regions. The temples pulsed with rhythms of community, celebration, mourning, knowledge, and offering, all wrapped in the scent of jasmine and sandalwood. Festivals further elevated the temple experience. Grand processions would spill out into streets, where deities were paraded on elaborately carved chariots pulled by thousands of devotees. Lamps flickered in every doorway, and the air shimmered with conch shells, bells, and devotional songs. These rituals renewed a sense of collective spiritual identity and infused every villager and king alike with shared reverence. Temples were no longer static. They danced with life, mirroring the divine rhythms they embodied. Despite cultural diversity and shifting dynasties, the underlying principles remained: harmony between cosmos and individual, structure and spirit. Each temple, with its mandala floor plan and sacred axis, mirrored the universe itself. Just as each sunrise brings a promise of continuity, so did every temple stone whisper of tradition that lived through devotion, knowledge, and sacred space. It was India's way of making the eternal tangible. As the centuries turned, Hindu temple architecture entered a golden age of innovation, particularly under the rule of the Cholas in southern India. The Cholas were not only mighty conquerors, but also devout patrons of Shaivism. Their dedication to Shiva was immortalized in monumental temple complexes, the most famous being the Brihadiswarar Temple at Tanjavur. Constructed in the 11th century, this temple showcased the grandeur of the cosmos through its towering Vimana and intricate bronze sculptures. The temple served as both a divine sanctuary and a political symbol of Chola supremacy. Within the temple complex, rituals unfolded like cosmic choreography. Daily ceremonies were performed with precision. Priests bathed the deity with milk, honey, and ghee, adorned the idol with silk and gold, and offered food and fragrant flowers. The temple resonated with chants, drums, and the steady glow of oil lamps. These rituals weren't mere performances. They were acts of devotion, thought to maintain cosmic balance. The deity wasn't just a statue. It was a living presence, believed to watch over community. Chola temples were also centers of economic and social life. With land grants and donations from kings and merchants, temples employed thousands: priests, dancers, cooks, gardeners, and scribes. They managed water resources, facilitated trade, and acted as banks. One inscription from a Chola temple lists payments made to flute players and flower vendors, revealing how seamlessly the sacred and secular intertwined. These temples were living ecosystems, self-sufficient and pulsating with community purpose. The Cholas also revolutionized religious art through their exquisite bronze casting techniques. These portable icons of gods, most notably Nataraja, the dancing Shiva, were paraded during festivals, embodying both grace and power. The Nataraja statue, with its circle of flames and poised balance, represented the cosmic dance of creation and destruction. These bronzes were more than art. They were vehicles of divine presence, carried through the streets to bless the land and its people. Even as political tides shifted and empires rose and fell, the temple tradition endured. The Chola legacy lived on not only through stone and metal, but also in the minds and hearts of the people. Temples became the spine of the spiritual landscape, where art, music, worship, and community life interlaced with quiet continuity. They stood as reminders that the divine could dwell not only in heaven, but here on earth, under every carved roof and whispering tree. As the Chola dynasty gave way to new powers, temple architecture continued to evolve. In northern India, a distinctive style emerged, the Nagara architecture. These temples were marked by their curvilinear spires, or shikaras, rising high above the sanctum like sacred mountains. Unlike the expansive complexes of the south, many northern temples emphasize verticality and a compact yet ornate appearance. One striking example is the Kandarya Mahadeva Temple in Khajuraho, built by the Chandala rulers, with its dizzying array of sculpted deities and celestial beings carved into sandstone. The temples of Khajuraho are especially famous for their depictions of human experience in all its dimensions: divine, everyday, and erotic. These images weren't merely decorative. They were meant to guide the devotee from the outer, worldly experiences toward inner spiritual realization. Walking clockwise around the temple, a pilgrim would journey from external carvings of daily life to deeper and more sacred spaces. In essence, the temple mirrored the soul's path, from distraction to focus, from chaos to clarity. Beyond architecture, temple towns blossomed. Places like Varanasi on the Ganges River became centers of devotion, learning, and pilgrimage. Though many structures were modest, their spiritual significance was immense. Pilgrims would bathe in the sacred river at dawn, walk barefoot through narrow alleys, and offer prayers at countless shrines. These towns became living maps of the Hindu cosmos, where each temple and riverbank held symbolic meaning, reminding devotees of their place within a divine order. In these temple towns, the pujari priest played a vital role, not just an officiant of rituals. He was a guide through the mysteries of devotion. The temple bell, the rising incense, the Sanskrit chants, all orchestrated by the pujari, were tools to transport the soul. Even the smallest village shrine had its rhythms of worship, its daily offerings, its faithful keepers. The divine was not far off, but intimately woven into every stone and sound of daily life. By now, temples had transcended their function as mere structures. They had become landscapes of spiritual memory. Whether in the mountainous north or tropical south, each region shaped temples in its image, from towering shikaras to vast courtyards, from holy tanks to celestial murals. Hindu temples became timeless sanctuaries where earth met heaven, and for millions, they were the quiet spaces where hearts could rest and souls could rise. The ritual calendar of Hindu temples pulsed with life, governed by the rhythms of the moon, stars, and sun. Each day began before dawn with the suprabhatam, a gentle awakening of the deity through chants and bells. As the stirring of beloved from slumber, devotees would gather quietly, oil lamps flickering in the pre-dawn mist, carrying garlands of marigold and jasmine. The scent of camphor, ghee, and incense filled the sanctum as the priest performed the first offering. These early moments were sacred, intimate, a spiritual beginning to the day for both deity and devotee. As the day unfolded, the temple became a microcosm of activity. The deity was bathed, dressed, and adorned with fresh flowers multiple times throughout the day. Midday rituals included offerings of fruits, cooked rice, and sweet confections like lattice or payasam. These were later distributed as prasadam, believed to carry divine blessings. Musicians would play nagaswaram and drums, and devotees sang devotional hymns that echoed through pillar halls. Even in silence, one could feel the hum of devotion, the timeless connection between gods and people, repeated with reverence through generations. Festivals were the heartbeat of temple life. During Navaratri or Diwali, temples came alive with an energy that transcended the ordinary. Colorful lanterns lined entranceways. Chariots were polished for processions, and temple towers were lit with rows of lamps that seemed to mirror the stars. Crowds would gather for nightly rituals, with children on shoulders, drums resounding, and fire dancers performing under the open sky. These were not just religious events. They were celebrations of cosmic order, of the divine descending into the world in all its radiance. Beyond the rituals themselves, the temple provided space for quiet reflection. In side corridors or shaded courtyards, elders would sit in silence, chanting under their breath. Young students studied ancient scriptures, while peacocks wandered the grounds. Monks swept stone floors with simple brooms, embodying a philosophy that cleanliness was not just physical, but spiritual. The hum of devotion was punctuated by stillness. Here, time moved differently, slower, deeper, echoing the eternal truths etched into temple walls. As dusk approached, the cycle neared its close with the Deeparati, or lamp ceremony. Flames circled before the deity. Conch shells blew, and bells rang out in unison. It was a moment of surrender and stillness, where the divine light symbolically banished the day's darkness. Devotees closed their eyes, palms pressed in prayer, the warmth of flame reflecting in their faces. In the soft glow of twilight, the temple stood not just as a monument, but as a living being, breathing devotion through every hour and offering sanctuary to those who sought peace. The architectural layout of Hindu temples was never random. It was deeply symbolic, often aligned with cosmic principles and spiritual progression. Most temples followed a traditional layout known as the Vastu Purusha Mandala, a sacred geometric diagram. The temple was seen as a microcosm of the universe, with the central sanctum, Garbhagriha, symbolizing the cosmic womb. Every corridor, doorway, and step leading inward was a transition from the material world towards spiritual realization. The temple didn't just house the divine, it embodied it. Visitors often entered through large gopurams or gateway towers, elaborately carved and rising high above the landscape. These portals were more than architectural marvels. They marked the transition from chaos to order, from worldly distractions to sacred contemplation. Pilgrims passed through these towering thresholds, greeted by guardian deities carved into walls, their expressions both fierce and protective. These carvings whispered myths and lessons, ensuring that no one stepped into the temple without being reminded of its sacred weight. As one moved inward, the temple's design became progressively more intimate and shadowed. The outer halls allowed for social gathering, learning, and music, while inner chambers were hushed, dimly lit, and fragrant with sandalwood. The very act of moving through a temple, removing shoes, walking barefoot over cool stone, and feeling the shift in light, was a form of purification. At the center lay the Garbhagriha, where the main deity resided in stillness and silence. Only priests entered the sanctum, representing humanity's most intimate connection to the divine. Above the sanctum rose the Shikara, a vertical tower shaped like a mountain, symbolizing the mythical Mount Meru, the axis of the universe in Hindu cosmology. These towers were often gilded or capped with a kalasha, sacred finial, catching sunlight and radiating it like a divine beacon. Birds circled overhead, and pilgrims gazed upward, drawn by the sense of transcendence it conveyed. This upward motion reflected the soul's journey, rising from earth toward the heavens, from confusion toward clarity. Temples were not merely buildings. They were design experiences, guiding both body and spirit. The journey through them was layered with symbolism, mirroring the path of spiritual awakening. Even in silence, the architecture spoke. It invited every soul to pass through thresholds, to leave behind burdens, and to stand before something larger, quieter, and infinitely more enduring. In these spaces, time slowed and the sacred became tangible, not through noise or spectacle, but through intentional form and gentle light. The rituals performed within Hindu temples were not spontaneous or improvised. They followed precise traditions passed down through generations. Every day began with a series of ceremonies, from awakening the deity to bathing and dressing the idol in fresh garments and flowers. Priests, known as pujaris, conducted these acts not merely as caretakers, but as intermediaries between the mortal and divine. The temple came alive with sound, conch shells blowing, bells ringing, mantras echoing through ancient corridors. Each ritual was a rhythmic offering of devotion and cosmic alignment. Music held a sacred role in temple life, especially through nadaswaram and percussion instruments that accompanied rituals. The melodies were often ragas designed to correspond with the time of day and emotional states. Temple musicians didn't perform for audiences. They played for the gods. Their music helped shape the energy of the space, guiding the minds of devotees toward focus and surrender. The rhythmic beats mirrored the heartbeat of the temple itself, while the drone of sacred notes grounded both priest and pilgrim alike. In addition to music, temple rituals included arti, a ceremony involving light. During arti, flames were circled before the deity in a symbolic gesture of offering and reverence. The flickering light danced on gold and gemstone-encrusted idols, creating an atmosphere of divine presence. Devotees cupped their hands of flame afterward, drawing the warmth to their eyes and foreheads, a symbolic absorption of divine light. In those moments, the line between the physical and spiritual seemed to blur, and even silence carried the weight of reverence. Seasonal festivals transformed temples into epicenters of vibrant activity. Celebrations like Diwali, Navaratri, and Pongal brought in waves of pilgrims, garlands of marigolds, and offerings of sweets and coconuts. Temple elephants were adorned in finery, and processions with deities carried on palanquins moved through streets. These festivals reminded people that divine joy was not confined to solemn prayer. It could burst forth in dance, color, and communal ecstasy. It was a sacred theater where gods and humans rejoiced together. Yet, beneath all the splendor and sound, temple rituals cultivated an inward quiet. The repetition of chants, the swaying of oil flames, the patterns of footsteps around the sanctum, they all worked together to create meditative stillness. Visitors might enter with thoughts swirling, but through the rituals, they were led gently toward peace. These sacred practices formed a bridge between the chaos of the outer world and the clarity of the inner soul, grounding each person in timeless rhythm and radiant calm. The inner sanctum of a Hindu temple, known as a Garbhagriha or womb chamber, was the most sacred space, quiet, dim, and heavy with devotion. This chamber housed the primary deity, often carved from black stone and decorated with fresh offerings. Only the temple's head priest was allowed inside, emphasizing the sanctity and mystery within. The design of the Garbhagriha was intentional. It was small, often with only one entrance, symbolizing a spiritual womb, where creation, rebirth, and the divine essence converge in complete stillness. Approaching the inner sanctum was a journey in itself. Long corridors, carved pillars, and gently rising floors guided the devotee's path from the noisy outer world toward an inward-facing stillness. Every step inward was symbolic, a shedding of external distractions, and a return inner truth. The temple's layout echoed a spiritual pilgrimage. From chaos to order, from multiplicity to unity, the journey culminated not in spectacle, but in stillness, where even breath seemed sacred. In some temples, the deity wasn't a statue but a natural form, like a lingam of uncarved stone or flame that burned eternally. These abstract forms emphasize the formless nature of the divine, inviting contemplation beyond images and identities. In Tamil Nadu, the 5 elemental temples honored earth, water, fire, air, and space. Each presented the divine through experience rather than appearance. These temples became not just places of worship, but embodiments of the universe's basic elements. Temple architecture was also filled with hidden geometries, the placement of shrines, the proportions of columns, and even the number of steps followed ancient texts like the Shilpa Shastras. These weren't just architectural manuals. They were spiritual blueprints. Every measurement was meant to harmonize human presence with cosmic order. As devotees stood beneath soaring gopurams or sat beneath carved mandapas, they were unknowingly positioned within sacred mathematics, a space built not just to impress, but to transform. To the outsider, the temple may seem full of complexity, ritual, and sound, but at its heart lay a simplicity, a still place where one could listen inward. Whether sitting in the back of a cool stone hall, eyes closed as chants floated through the air, or touching the feet of a deity carved long ago, the experience was designed to awaken quiet within. The temple was not only a building, it was a state of mind, silent, sacred, and eternal. Festivals brought Hindu temples to life in bursts of sound, color, and shared joy. From the quiet rhythms of daily worship, temple grounds transformed into vibrant epicenters during major festivals like Diwali, Holi, or Navaratri. Families arrived in their finest attire. Children ran between vendors, and flower garlands draped doorways and pillars. Light spilled from every crevice. Lamps, torches, and decorative lanterns made the temple glow like a beacon. For one night or several, the temple was no longer still. It was the heart of a living celebration. During chariot festivals like Rath Yatra, massive processions rolled through the streets. Towering temple cars, wooden chariots several stories high, carried the gods outside their sanctums so all could see and celebrate. These grand journeys reminded devotees that the divine was not confined to inner chambers. It moved among them, part of their world. Accompanied by music, drums, and cheers, these moments fused joy with devotion, and stone icons with communal humanity. Each festival carried layers of mythology. During Navaratri, for instance, 9 nights were devoted to the goddess Durga in her various forms, from gentle to fierce. Dance performances, devotional songs, and elaborate rituals filled each evening. For devotees, it was a sacred drama unfolding before them. Stories not just told, but danced, sung, and lived. Even the decorations reflected these shifts, evolving nightly in color and theme. It was religion as sensory experience, as poetry and movement and music. While joyous, these festivals also deepened community ties. Temples became the center for feeding the poor, sheltering travelers, and organizing local artisans. Cooks prepared massive quantities of prasadam, blessed food, to share freely. Volunteers swept the grounds, lit lamps, or helped elders walk through crowds. Here, spiritual merit wasn't gained through isolation but service. Festivals turned temples into engines of compassion, reminding all that the divine shines brightest when shared. And then, after the music faded and the crowds dispersed, the temple returned to stillness. The oil lamps flickered gently in the breeze, flower petals lay scattered across cool stones, and a sense of sacred echo lingered in the air. The festival had ended, but the energy remained. Residue of prayers whispered, laughter shared, and hearts lifted. Even in sleep, the temple seemed alive, dreaming with its people, preparing for the next sacred rhythm of celebration and peace. Temples did not exist in isolation. They were woven into the fabric of their towns and cities. Around great temple complexes, entire neighborhoods thrived. Markets buzzed with sellers offering jasmine garlands, brass lamps, sweets, and spices. Pilgrims bought offerings, bartered with local artisans, or rested in dharmashalas, rest houses. The air carried the sound of temple bells and street musicians, blending sacred and secular into a single melodic pulse. The temple was not only a place of prayer, it was a beating heart in the city's chest. In many towns, temple economies were self-sustaining. Land grants from kings or wealthy donors provided rice fields, orchards, or wells, managed by temple staff. The produce supported priests and workers while feeding pilgrims. Inscriptions etched on stone walls detailed these donations, records of how deeply faith and economy were entwined. Some temples even functioned like banks, storing treasures in secure inner vaults and offering loans to local traders or farmers, securing their roles as both spiritual and practical anchors. As patrons of the arts, temples shaped cultural life. Dancers trained in the sacred art of baritanity and performed as acts of devotion, not just entertainment. Musicians played the veena or mridangam in rhythmic harmony with daily rituals. Sculptors and painters, funded by temple trusts, adorned shrines with stories of gods and celestial worlds. Art was not separate from worship. It was worship. Through rhythm, movement, sound, and color, temples gave artists a divine purpose and spiritual audience. Children grew up in the shade of temple gopurams, towers, learning stories of the Ramayana and Mahabharata from elders, priests, or wandering bards. Education often began at the temple, where young minds were introduced to letters, mantras, and math. Temples were schools, libraries, and archives. Palm leaf manuscripts lined inner chambers. Philosophers debated under banyan trees, and wisdom passed through generations like a quiet flame carried in cupped hands. Knowledge and faith were never far apart. This seamless blending of sacred and secular made Hindu temples more than monuments. They were engines of civilization. Their towers pointed to the heavens, but their foundations were laid deep in community soil. In their walls echoed chants and markets, meditation and laughter, solitude and society. They taught generations how to live with purpose, to serve, to seek beauty, and to find meaning in both silence and song. In every stone, something human endured and something divine. Every temple ritual was guided by precise timing, muhurta, and celestial alignment. Astrology, or Jyotisha, played a vital role in determining when ceremonies should occur. Priests consulted ancient almanacs, aligning earthly rhythms with cosmic movements. Sunrise prayers, midday offerings, and twilight chants echoed the passage of time and celebrated its sacred cycles. Devotees were reminded daily that their lives were part of something greater, tethered to the stars and the spinning of unseen wheels in the heavens. The changing seasons brought grand festivals. Temples transformed into vibrant arenas of devotion and joy. Car processions, rathas, rolled through streets. Deities were paraded in gold and silk, and drums echoed like thunder. The festivals were both communal and cosmic. They honored the return of monsoons, solstices, harvests, or mythic victories. Lamps floated on rivers. Flowers rained from balconies. The entire city glowed as if heaven had opened its gates to walk among the faithful. Temples also marked life's transitions. A child's first haircut, a student's initiation, a couple's wedding, or a devotee's last rites. All were conducted within temple grounds. Each event was infused with ritual, symbol, and prayer. These rites didn't just sanctify individual lives. They anchored people within the collective rhythm of culture and cosmos. Every soul's journey was echoed in the chants of priests and the fragrance of sandalwood, offering continuity amid life's many changes. In remote temples atop mountains or deep in forests, silence reigned. Their rituals were fewer but no less profound. Hermit priests tended to ancient idols, often passed down over centuries. The architecture was simpler, but the spiritual resonance was just as powerful. These temples served seekers who came not for spectacle, but for stillness, those yearning to listen to quiet presence of the divine through wind, birdsong, or the slow-burning flame of a single lamp. Whether grand or humble, in crowded cities or silent hills, Hindu temples held time within their walls. Their rituals were clocks of the soul, their festivals calendars of emotion. They gave structure to the day, shaped the seasons, and meaning to a lifetime. In their rhythms, people found both order and wonder, a sacred choreography in which all were invited to take part, not just as observers, but as dancers in the divine performance of existence. The sacred geometry of Hindu temples was no accident. It was a divine science. Each stone, arch, and tower was placed with deep symbolic intention. Architects followed the Vasta Shastra, an ancient text that blended art, astronomy, and spirituality. The temple layout mirrored the human body and the cosmos. The central Garbhagriha, sanctum, was a heart or womb, where divine energy was concentrated, while each concentric layer symbolized deeper immersion into sacred space and consciousness. The rising spire, or Shikara, represented Mount Meru, the mythic axis of the universe in Hindu cosmology. As pilgrims walked from the outer gates inward, They symbolically ascended from the earthly to the divine. Every step, pillar, and carving along the path told stories of gods, demons, and sages. These were not just decorations, but lessons encoded in stone. The structure was a mandala in 3 dimensions, a meditation one walked through. The materials used in temple construction also held meaning. Granite, sandstone, and marble were chosen not only for durability, but for their connection to Earth's natural energies. Precious metals like gold and copper were placed under idols or atop towers to draw celestial blessings. Even the direction a temple faced was significant. Most open toward the east to catch the first light of dawn, the sun's sacred gaze beginning each day in blessing. Temple walls spoke in carvings, each panel a page in a silent book. Scenes from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Puranas adorned entrances and courtyards. Dancers with frozen grace, warriors mid-battle, sages lost in trance, all sculpted with such precision that one could almost hear the music, the chants, the thunder of hooves. These visuals taught illiterate devotees the myths and moral lessons of their faith through awe and beauty. Each temple was a place where architecture and belief met in harmony. It wasn't just a building. It was a living metaphor, a cosmic diagram, and a divine portal. Standing within its cool stone walls, surrounded by incense, echoes, and light filtering through lattices, one felt the precision of faith and the grace of intention. Every angle whispered eternity. Every shadow honored the sacred. And in the stillness, time itself bowed in reverence. Beyond their architectural brilliance, Hindu temples were alive with sacred rituals that followed precise rhythms. Each day began before sunrise as temple priests, pujaris, woke the deity with chants, music, and offerings. This act, called saprabhatam, treated the deity as a living presence. The rituals moved like clockwork, bathing the idol, adorning it with silks and flowers, offering food, naivedya, and performing arati with lamps. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were deeply personal acts of devotion. The naivedya offerings reflected regional tastes: spiced rice in the south, sweet lattice in the north. Food was first given to the deity, believed to be transformed by divine presence, and then distributed as prasadam to devotees. It wasn't just food. It was sanctified energy, taken with closed eyes and reverent hands. The act symbolized a deep bond between the divine and the human, one that passed through breath, taste, and nourishment. Music was another soul of temple life. Instruments like the mridangam, nadaswaram, and conch shells echoed in stone halls, accompanying daily rituals. Chants and hymns, passed down orally for generations, wove the ancient Sanskrit into melodies that vibrated with devotion. The temple wasn't silent. It breathed sound. Each note was meant to cleanse, uplift, and connect listeners to the divine frequency, the unseen vibration said to form the universe itself. Festivals brought the temple fully to life. On days like Mahashivaratri or Navaratri, thousands gathered. Deities were paraded outside on chariots or palanquins, dressed in gold and jewels, surrounded by drums and dancers. The energy was electric, but reverent. Lamps lit up entire temple towers. Flowers carpeted the ground. Rituals extended through the night. It was communal ecstasy, a grand reminder that the sacred wasn't only inside the sanctum. It was in the shared joy of celebration. But in quieter moments, too, the temple remained sacred. A lone pilgrim might sit in meditation under a banyan tree within the courtyard, the rustle of leaves mixing with distant chants. Temples offered both communal and personal pathways to the divine. They were spaces to weep, rejoice, reflect, or simply breathe. In their timeless rituals, one found order in chaos, and in the sacred repetition, a peace deeper than words. Hindu temples have long served as guardians of knowledge and centers of education. In ancient times, many temple complexes included gurukuls, residential schools where young students lived and learned under the guidance of a guru. These were not merely religious centers, but institutions that cultivated philosophy, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and the arts. Knowledge wasn't divorced from spirituality. It was seen as part of a sacred journey toward wisdom, vidya, and liberation, moksha. The temple libraries, known as Granabandharas, held carefully preserved palm leaf manuscripts, some bound with cloth, others etched with metallic ink and treated with turmeric for longevity. These texts explored complex philosophies like Vedanta, Ayurveda, and Jyotisha astrology. Preservation was an act of devotion. Copying text by hand was considered sacred labor. Monks and scholars viewed every word not just as knowledge, but as a vibration of cosmic truth. Temples also became epicenters for performing arts. Classical dance forms like Bharatanatyam and Odissi originated as sacred offerings to deity, performed in the mandapa pillared halls. Each movement, gesture, and expression was encoded with meaning. Dancers became vessels for divine stories. Temple musicians similarly honed their craft in praise of the gods, composing ragas and lyrics that echoed spiritual longing, divine love, and cosmic cycles. Language flourished under temple patronage. Sanskrit, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and other regional languages found expression in devotional hymns like the Devarams and Bhagavata Puranas. Poet-saints like Undal Tulsidas and Bhaiva composed verses that shaped spiritual and social thought alike. Many temples commissioned inscriptions on stone, detailing everything from land grants to philosophical ideas, ensuring that language lived not just on paper, but in enduring stone. This integration of knowledge, art, and devotion transformed temples into living universities. They did not separate science and spirit, music and math, or architecture and philosophy. Instead, everything was part of a unified worldview, a sacred ecosystem where the pursuit of truth was both inward and outward. Even today, standing in these temples, one can almost hear the echo of sacred chants merging with the rhythm of ancient wisdom. The rituals within Hindu temples form the heartbeat of spiritual life, practiced daily with unwavering rhythm and ancient precision. These ceremonies, ranging from dawn ablutions to evening arti, connect the divine and human through gesture, sound, and scent. Priests begin each day with abhisheka, a ritual bathing of the deity with water, milk, honey, and ghee, symbolizing purification. This act transforms the idol from stone to spirit, inviting divinity into the space and into the hearts of worshippers. Following this, the deity is adorned with vibrant garlands, silk robes, gold jewelry, and vermilion markings. Devotees often contribute these offerings, believing that caring for the deity brings blessings. The temple becomes a home, with the god treated as an honored guest, fed, bathed, dressed, and serenaded. The Alankara decorating ritual is both aesthetic and symbolic, representing abundance, grace, and the human desire to reach the divine through beauty. At midday and evening, arti is performed. Flames dancing on brass lamps wave before deity, while bells ring, conch shells blow, and devotional songs rise. The light represents knowledge and the divine presence, and when worshippers pass their hands over flame and touch their eyes, it is a gesture of internalizing the sacred energy. The sensory immersion, smoke from incense, the glint of lamps, rhythmic chants, evokes a trance-like peace that calms even the most restless minds. Special festivals deepen the ritual cycle. On nights like Mahashivaratri or Navaratri, temples come alive with thousands of lamps, flower mandalas, and all-night chanting. Processions wind through streets with chariots bearing idols, accompanied by drummers and dancers. These festivals blend community with divinity, where collective joy and reverence elevate the sacred. For pilgrims, attending such events is both celebration and purification, a way to renew vows, seek visions, and feel the vastness of the divine presence. These rituals are not just acts of worship. They are meditations in motion. Each offering, chant, and flame is a conversation with the eternal. The temple rituals guide the mind from outer noise to inner stillness, inviting reflection, humility, and surrender. Even centuries later, their unbroken practice speaks of tradition both timeless and alive, still echoing through incense-laced air and golden-lit sanctuaries at the edge of night. Temples in South India stand as masterpieces of sacred geometry, architectural symmetry, and mythic storytelling rendered in stone. Dravidian architecture, known for its towering gopurams, gateway towers, elaborate carvings, and pillared halls, reaches its height in temples like Meenakshi in Madurai and Brihadiswarar in Tanjavur. These temples are more than places of worship. They are cosmic diagrams brought to life, designed to mirror the order of the universe and guide the soul toward liberation. The layout of these temples follows the ancient Vastashastra, where each element is placed according to spiritual function. The Sanctum Sanctorum Garbhagriha lies at the center, representing the cosmic womb from which all creation arises. Long corridors and concentric squares echo the journey from the material world into the spiritual core. Devotees circumambulate through these pathways as a form of meditation, their footsteps part of a centuries-old rhythm of reverence. What sets these temples apart is their storytelling through sculpture. Every inch of stone seems alive. Gods in dynamic poses, dancers mid-movement, mythical beasts, sages, and meditation. These carvings are not decorative. They're scripture in stone, teaching epics like the Ramayana and Mahabharata, and preserving local legends, moral tales, and cosmic truths. For those unable to read text, these visual stories offered spiritual insight in a form that touched the senses and the soul. The grandeur of these temples also supported artistic innovation. Dance, music, and sculpture all found fertile ground in their precincts. Devadasis, women dedicated to temple service, performed classical dances as acts of devotion. Musicians offer ragas as spiritual offerings. Architects and artisans passed down knowledge through generations, not through books, but through mentorship in the stones themselves. Temples became not only centers of worship, but universities of art, science, and philosophy. To walk through a South Indian temple is to step into a time machine, one that hums with chants, echoes with history, and glows with purpose. Even in silence, the stone walls whisper teachings that have outlived empires. These temples are not frozen relics. They breathe through rituals, festivals, and devotion that continues into the modern day. They remind us that the sacred can be built, brick by brick, and lived in across the centuries. The sacred role of water in Hindu temples cannot be overstated. It is both physically and symbolically essential, serving to purify, to bless, and to connect the earthly with the divine. Within most temple complexes, a tank or pool known as a pushkarini lies near the entrance or at the heart of the grounds. These water bodies are not ornamental but spiritual, reflecting the belief that water is a carrier of divine energy, capable of cleansing both body and soul. Pilgrims often bathe in these tanks before entering the inner sanctum, a symbolic washing away of worldly impurities. In sacred cities like Varanasi or Madurai, temple tanks serve as gathering places for morning prayers, chants, and quiet introspection. The water is considered sacred in itself, often believed to be infused with power through proximity to deities and rituals. These acts of purification aren't just tradition. They are rituals that link human existence to the cosmic order. Beyond bathing, water is a central part of daily worship. Priests pour sacred water over idols in a ritual called abhisheka, using water from rivers like the Ganges or from temple tanks themselves. This act symbolizes devotion and the renewal of the deity's presence. The droplets are not discarded. They're collected and offered to devotees as tirtha, a blessed elixir said to carry divine blessings. Thus, water flows from God to priest to pilgrim, forming a sacred chain of energy and intention. Some temple tanks have their own legends, believed to be created by divine hands or linked to epics like the Ramayana and Mahabharata. For instance, the golden tank of the Meenakshi temple is said to be where the golden lotus bloomed, symbolizing divine creation. Stories such as these are whispered during twilight walks around the tank's edge, passed from one pilgrim to another like sacred heirlooms of the land. The water becomes more than an element. It is a memory, a myth, a mirror. At night, when the temple quiets and the moon reflects on the water's surface, the tank seems to breathe. Birds settle in trees, oil lamps flicker on the water, and incense trails drift across the stillness. It is here that the power of water is most deeply felt, not as something to be used, but as something to be honored. A sacred stillness hangs over the temple complex, and in that moment, the water whispers to all who listen, "You are cleansed, you are seen, you are part of the divine." As the sacred rhythms of temple life culminate in festivals, India's temples transform from places of quiet devotion into vibrant epicenters of celebration. Temple festivals are not merely social events. They are cosmic dramas, reenactments of mythology, symbolic renewals of divine presence, and affirmations of community unity. They mark the turning of seasons, victories of deities, and a harmonious relationship between humans and gods. Each festival pulses with sacred intent, wrapped in layers of music, ritual, and beauty. Central to many festivals are the rathas or temple chariots, massive wooden structures pulled by thousands of devotees through the streets. During events like Ratha Yatra in Puri or the Grand Chariot Festival of Thiruvarur, deities leave their sanctums and visit the world. This sacred journey allows even those who cannot enter temples to witness and worship the divine. The procession is accompanied by drums, chants, and a shower of flower petals. The street becomes sacred ground, the community a moving temple. Ritual dramas are another essential part of temple festivals. In Tamil Nadu, for instance, Kutha performances bring epics like the Ramayana to life under open skies, with villagers watching wide-eyed as actors in colorful costumes embody gods, demons, and heroes. These performances don't merely entertain, they instruct, inspire, and preserve cultural memory. The divine stories are not distant. They're lived and relived, echoed in the laughter, tears, and awe of the gathered devotees. The energy of a festival is both ecstatic and contemplative. As bells ring, incense thickens the air, and oil lamps flicker in the night, the sensory experience becomes overwhelming in the most spiritual way. This fusion of sound, scent, and sacred motion is designed not to distract, but to elevate. Devotees sing, dance, offer prayers, and experience a collective transcendence. For many, these are moments when the boundary between the mortal and the divine dissolves, leaving behind only presence. As the festival draws to a close and the final prayers are whispered into the cooling air, the temple returns to stillness. The colors fade, the music quiets, but something remains. The sacred energy stirred by the collective devotion lingers in the walls, in the earth, in the hearts of all who participated. The temple's soul has been renewed, and so have those who walked its sacred paths. In the silence that follows celebration, sleep descends like a benediction.